So a while back, we had an assignment over Bernie Sanders' speech to Liberty University. And in this speech, he addressed the income inequality and child poverty, being raised in poverty. So this made me wonder, is there this many kids suffering? He claims that there's a total of 20% of children in America are growing up in poverty. So I researched this because this number seemed awful high. And as I researched it, I found that actually it's 22%, according to USA Today's Jennifer Kalfas. So I was amazed that there's this many people living in poverty. I was rather surprised. Because that means in this room alone, there's 4 to 5 people that grew up in poverty. As I researched this, I was looking for the correlation between the income inequality that he claimed and the child poverty. So a quote I found is, the bottom 40% of the population controls a total of 0.3% of the wealth, and the top 20% controls over 84%. This is by The Atlantic's Dan Ariely. That's a lot of difference there, because the 84% is a vast majority of the wealth in America, while 40% of the citizens only control 0.3. So the question this arises is, where do we fall as Americans? Are we in that top 20%? Are we in the bottom? Are we someplace in between? Chances are most of us would picture ourselves as someplace in the middle, what we call the middle class. But the growing income inequality is making this middle class disappear. So as the saying goes, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. The middle class typically does not stay in the middle class. Typically they'll move up or they'll move down. In the 1960s, over half of the American population was in the middle class, and they would typically move up out of the middle class into the upper class. Now, typically the middle class doesn't move up, we move down. And we went from being 50% in the 1960s down to 37% now, and it's continually going down. This is threatening American ideals, such as the American dream. That's a middle class ideal typically. And with the disappearing middle class, this is becoming just that, a dream. But less division between classes, this is making this more and more untrue that there is the American dream. People say that America is the land of opportunity, so you make your own wealth, you make your own opportunities. But with the income inequality, the same opportunities are not available to everybody. So what can we do about this? What are we as Americans capable of doing? One of the most viable solutions is the upcoming election. Most of us in this room are getting into the age we're old enough to elect somebody. So how do you know who to elect? You need to know your candidates. Each one has a different view on this type of topic. For example, Donald Trump, he thinks that we need to reduce CEO salaries that can be 300 times what another employee at the same company makes, and that we need to limit tax breaks on the rich and increase their taxes. Jeb Bush thinks that the opportunity gap is the reason to blame, that the rich are getting too many more opportunities than people from the poor. So he thinks that this needs to be addressed, and this is his solution. Rand Paul thinks that some people simply work harder, and that is why they're in the upper class, that by working harder, longer hours, they're able to make their way and get into the upper class. Chris Christie blames government handouts, saying that programs the government runs right now, such as Obamacare and going into other things such as Social Security and many other programs the government offers to help those, as well as like disability, saying that this is the reason to blame by influencing people to not work as hard because they think they can get a handout somehow by just not doing anything. So by the election time, almost all of us will be 18 and in our position to vote for the first time in our lives. So what I want you to do is be informed about this election and try and make a good decision and influence your country.
What does Bernie Sanders say about it?
Bernie Sanders was on the similar stance to Donald Trump. He says that the rich need to be taxed more, and we need to start bridging the opportunity gap to try and give everybody equal opportunity and get back to where we used to be with a larger middle class.
What else can we do, your generation, my generation, do besides who we elect for this next presidential election? Does it go beyond that, or is that the only way to solve this problem?
There's other solutions. one of the solutions is that many of the people that don't go to college typically don't enter into the middle class. So one solution is to go to college and try and pay off your debt, because many of the bottom 40%, that is only 0.3% of the wealth, is people that went to college but didn't finish or are still paying off their degrees, and they have a negative net worth to the government. So while they might not be worth something now, in the future they might be worth something and worth their way into that middle class.
What's your definition of like the middle class?
Typically, a middle class person falls in the category of the income level of $33,000 to $100,000. It also depends on where you live, because, for example, Franklin County is Indiana has lower tax rates than Ohio, and Franklin County is lower than about any place else in Indiana, versus like New York, where it's going to be much more expensive.
So does that mean we're more or lower?
We're lower tax-wise, so typically the income levels around here are going to be lower than someplace else, because to pay our taxes isn't as difficult as someplace